Blackwood Manor came into view like a monument to tragedy, shrouded in the amber glow of the setting sun. The cold, unforgiving shadows it cast seemed to stretch out, clawing at the land that surrounded it. As the car slowed along the gravel drive, I found myself leaning closer to the window, attempting to take in every detail. The building loomed as if it might collapse under the weight of its own history, its Gothic spires piercing the sky, ivy crawling up its weathered facade like skeletal fingers. "You're unusually quiet, Miguel," Elliot said from the seat beside me. His voice held that customary calm, an ever-present undercurrent of rationality even in moments like this. He was watching me from behind his dark-rimmed spectacles, his steel-blue eyes sharp and searching. I turned to him, offering a weak smile, just taking it in. Elliot's gaze drifted back to the manor. He nodded. "It's meant to do that. Places like this, built with stories and soaked in secrets, force you to listen before you even enter." I didn't respond. He was right, of course. He always was. The driver stopped the car at the base of the manor steps, and the sound of the crunching gravel faded into the crisp autumn air. As we stepped out, I felt an odd sense of dread curl in my chest. Not heavy, but tangible. Elliot adjusted his scarf as he surveyed the manor, while I made a point of pulling my coat tighter against the evening chill. At the top of the stone steps, a figure stood waiting, framed by the yawning doorway behind her. Agnes Turner, the caretaker of Blackwood Manor, fit the space as if carved into it. She was wiry and unyielding, her severe posture mirrored in the sharp lines of her silver hair, which was pinned neatly back. "Mr. Brooks, Mr. Vasquez," she said, her tone clipped and efficient as she descended the stairs. "We're grateful you've come." "The pleasure is ours," Elliot replied, holding out his hand. As always, his politeness radiated through every word, the practiced tone of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. Agnes hesitated before taking his hand. She glanced briefly at me, her gaze heavy with something unreadable. "The house has been restless since Mr. Blackwood's death," she said. "I imagine you'll find that out soon enough." Elliot inclined his head, letting her words linger as she turned and began her ascent back up the steps. I looked at him questioningly, but he only gestured for me to follow, his trench coat billowing behind him as he strode toward the manor. The doors groaned on their hinges as we entered. The inside was no less imposing than the exterior, though it carried an unsettling beauty. Every detail of the grand foyer demanded attention. The chandelier above, its crystals glinting faintly in the dim light, the intricately carved banisters of the sweeping staircase, and the ancestral portraits hanging on the walls, their subjects locked in perpetual, disapproving stares. "Doesn't scream welcome home, does it?" I muttered, my voice low enough not to carry beyond Elliot. He smirked faintly. "It's not meant to." Agnes turned to us sharply, her heeled shoes clicking on the wooden floor. "You'll have time to investigate tomorrow," she announced. "For now, I'll show you to your rooms. Dinner will be served at 7. We followed her through the house, her steps echoing through the cavernous halls. I found my gaze drifting to the paintings lining the corridor, each Blackwood ancestor more severe than the last. Their eyes seemed to follow us, shadows gathering around their painted forms. "Miss Turner," I began hesitantly, my curiosity outweighing my better judgment. "Is there any truth to the rumors about Eleanor Blackwood?" Agnes stopped abruptly, turning to face me. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something crack in her composure, but the facade returned just as quickly. "We'll discuss the Blackwood family history after dinner," she said flatly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Elliot gave me a warning glance, a silent signal to let the subject drop. We arrived at our rooms soon after. Agnes pushed open the heavy door to mine, revealing a space that, much like the rest of the manor, straddled the line between grandeur and neglect. A large four-poster bed with an ornately carved headboard dominated the room, flanked by a mahogany desk and an armchair positioned by the window. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I thanked Agnes, who nodded curtly before leaving to show Elliot to his room. Once alone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and crossed to the window. The view overlooked the grounds, the gnarled trees swaying in the wind as if whispering secrets to one another. The sound of a soft knock startled me, and I turned to find Elliot entering without waiting for a response. His hat was now tucked under one arm, and his expression was thoughtful. "Settling in?" he asked. "As much as one can in a place like this," I replied. "And you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he wandered to the fireplace, holding his hands out toward the flames. "Agnes is hiding something," he said at last, his voice low. "Do you think it's related to Charles Blackwood's death?" "Perhaps," he admitted, "but there's more to it. Whatever this family has buried, it runs deep, deeper than one man's murder." I frowned, my gaze drifting back to the window. The estate seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, the boundaries consumed by the encroaching forest. There was a kind of loneliness to it, a vast emptiness that no amount of opulence could conceal. "Do you think the rumors are true?" I asked after a moment. "About Eleanor haunting this place?" Elliot's lips quirked into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Every ghost has its origin, Miguel," he said cryptically. "I intend to find hers." A soft chime echoed faintly through the halls, signaling the hour. 7. "Dinner," Elliot said simply, straightening and brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. I followed him down to the dining room, where we were met by Agnes and a handful of staff who moved efficiently around the table, setting plates and pouring wine. The meal itself was rich and hearty, yet the atmosphere was anything but warm. Agnes said little, and Elliot asked fewer questions than I expected, opting instead to observe her closely. As the last course was served, Elliot finally broke the silence. "Miss Turner," he began, his tone conversational but laced with an undertone of purpose, "what can you tell us about the crypt?" The effect was immediate. Agnes's hand stilled over her glass, her knuckles whitening. She composed herself quickly, but the moment hadn't escaped my notice or Elliot's. "The crypt is off limits," she said curtly. "And yet, it's where Charles's body was found," Elliot countered, his gaze steady. Agnes hesitated, her mask of professionalism faltering. "I think that's enough for tonight," she said, rising abruptly. "You'll have access to the areas you need tomorrow. Until then, I suggest you get some rest." Elliot inclined his head, but his expression was unreadable. As we left the dining room and climbed the stairs back to our rooms, I couldn't shake the tension that clung to the air. "She's afraid," I said finally, breaking the silence between us. Elliot didn't look at me, his gaze fixed ahead. "And fear makes people sloppy." As we reached my door, he paused, glancing back toward the corridor. His expression softened, if only slightly. "Lock your door tonight, Miguel." Before I could ask why, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with nothing but the soft crackling of distant flames and the weight of questions that demanded answers. The darkness that had crept into Blackwood Manor the night before lingered as morning broke. Sunlight filtered through the thick, velvet curtains in my room, thin rays barely illuminating the antique furnishings. For a moment, I lay still, trying to make sense of the unease that gripped me, but the memory of the evening returned quickly. The cryptic answers, the looming shadows, and Elliot's chilling parting words. "Lock your door tonight." I had done as he suggested, but the sound of soft creaks and faint whispers echoing through the halls had kept me awake for most of the night. The manor, it seemed, didn't approve of peaceful slumber. A sharp knock broke through my thoughts, and I swung my legs off the bed. It was Elliot, of course, his impeccable sense of time ensuring we began the day's work before the house had even fully stirred. "Good morning," he said as I opened the door, his voice crisp and alert, as if he'd slept a full 8 hours, a luxury I doubted he'd indulged in. He was already dressed, his trench coat draped neatly over his arm and his hat in hand. "I trust you're ready to begin?" "Not as ready as you seem to be," I replied, stifling a yawn. "Did you even sleep?" Elliot gave one of his faint smiles, the kind that always carried an air of mystery. "Not nearly enough, but we have much to do." Within moments, I was dressed and following Elliot down the grand staircase. The manor seemed quieter in the early light, but the same oppressive air hung in the vast, open spaces. As we passed beneath the ancestral portraits in the foyer, I couldn't shake the feeling that their painted eyes were following us. Agnes Turner was waiting for us in the dining room, her usual sternness softened by the gentle clinking of china as she poured tea from an ornate silver pot. "Good morning, gentlemen," she greeted, placing the pot down with precision. "I trust you both slept well?" Elliot answered smoothly, "About as well as can be expected in a house filled with mysteries, Miss Turner." Her lips tightened into what might have been a fleeting smile, though it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Breakfast has been prepared. I'll have someone bring it out shortly, but I imagine you're more interested in the crypt." Elliot and I exchanged a glance. "If it wouldn't trouble you," Elliot said, his tone polite but purposeful. Agnes nodded. "It's no trouble. I'll fetch the keys." As she left the room, I turned to Elliot. "We're heading into the crypt first thing? Shouldn't we be piecing together some of what we already know?" "We'll have time for that," he said, picking up a cup of tea and inspecting it as though it might hold a clue. "The crypt may reveal connections we haven't yet considered. And besides," he set the cup down with a soft clink, "it's not every day one has access to a family crypt filled with secrets." Agnes returned moments later, holding an old iron key that looked as though it belonged to another century. She led us through the sprawling hallways of the manor until we reached a door tucked away beneath the grand staircase. The door itself was unremarkable, its heavy wood marked with the wear of time, but the chill that seeped through its edges was palpable. "The Blackwoods have used this crypt for generations," Agnes explained as she worked the key into the rusted lock. "Charles was the last to be interred here." The lock gave way with a reluctant groan, and the door creaked open to reveal a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. A damp, earthy scent wafted up to greet us, and the faint glimmer of candlelight flickered at the bottom. Agnes handed Elliot a lantern, her hand trembling slightly. "I'll leave you to your investigation," she said, stepping back. "I don't care much for the crypt." "You've been most helpful," Elliot said, inclining his head. "We'll let you know if we find anything of significance." As we descended the staircase, The air grew colder and heavier. The lantern's light danced along the uneven stone walls, illuminating centuries-old inscriptions and faded carvings of angels and mourning figures. The crypt was a labyrinth of small alcoves, each holding ornate stone coffins adorned with the Blackwood family crest. "Not exactly welcoming, is it?" I murmured, my voice echoing softly in the confined space. "It's a resting place, Miguel, not a parlor," Elliot replied, though his sharp eyes were scanning every detail, taking in far more than I could. We approached the most recent addition to the crypt, a coffin bearing the name Charles Blackwood. Unlike the others, it lacked the decorative flourish of age. Its surface was simple, unadorned, almost deliberately plain. Elliot crouched beside it, running his hand along the edge. "No signs of tampering, at least externally," he said, his tone more to himself than to me. "But appearances can be deceiving." As he examined the coffin, I noticed something unusual nearby, a scattering of small, blackened petals, as if from a long-dead flower. I picked one up, turning it over in my hand. "Elliot, look at this. These petals, they seem out of place." He glanced over, his brow furrowing. "A black rose, uncommon but not unheard of. It could mean something, or it could simply be a token left by a mourner." "Do mourners often leave tokens in crypts no one dares to visit?" I countered. Elliot's smile was faint but approving. "Fair point. Let's keep it in mind." We continued our search, moving deeper into the crypt. The atmosphere seemed to press in around us, the silence broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the stone ceiling. It was here that we found something truly unusual. Tucked into an alcove, almost hidden behind one of the larger coffins, was a small, locked chest. The wood was dark and weathered, bound with iron, and the lock looked as old as the crypt itself. Elliot knelt before it, examining the lock closely. "This chest doesn't belong here," he said, his tone decisive. "It's not part of the crypt's design." "Another Blackwood secret?" I guessed. "Perhaps." He pulled a set of tools from his coat, a lock-picking kit he carried for moments like these. With practiced precision, he worked the lock, the faint sound of clicking echoing through the crypt until, at last, it gave way. Inside were papers, fragile, yellowed, and covered in the looping script of an earlier era. Elliot lifted them carefully, scanning the text with that keen, focused intensity one had come to expect. "These are letters," he said, passing one to me. "Correspondence between Charles and someone named Victor Blackwood." I read the letter, my heart quickening with each word. The contents were cryptic but hinted at a family dispute over the ownership of certain properties, and something more ominous, something tied to the manor's darkest secrets. This Victor, wasn't he mentioned in the Blackwood family history we found in the library? I asked. Elliot nodded. "Indeed, a cousin of Charles, if I recall, banished from the family for reasons that were never fully explained. And now his letters are hidden in the crypt," I said, glancing around at the oppressive stone walls. "What does that say about this family?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded the letters carefully and placed them back into the chest. "It says there's more to this story than we've been told. Let's take these back to the study and examine them further." As we ascended the staircase, the crypt's chill seemed to cling to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we reached the top, Agnes was waiting, her face pale but composed. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tight. "We found clues," Elliot replied, "but they only raise more questions." Her gaze flicked to the chest in Elliot's hands, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw a crack in her stoic facade, a flicker of fear. "What sort of questions?" she asked cautiously. Elliot's smile was thin, almost calculating. "Questions that need answers, Miss Turner. Answers that I suspect this manor has been guarding for far too long." The morning air was heavy with a chill that seeped through the cracks of Blackwood Manor, as though the house itself were exhaling its ancient secrets. I followed Elliot through the hallway, our footsteps muffled by the thick rugs lining the wooden floors. He moved with that calm, precise determination I had grown accustomed to, his hat tilted slightly forward as if it were a shield against the weight of unsolved mysteries. "Do you think Miss Turner suspects what we found in Charles's letters?" I asked, glancing down at my pocket where one of the crinkled pages rested, hidden from curious eyes. "She suspects many things," Elliot replied without slowing. "But suspicion and certainty are worlds apart, Miguel. That's why we're here, to bridge that distance." The study waited for us at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar, as though it, too, anticipated our arrival. I nudged it open, and the room greeted us with the smell of tobacco and parchment, a combination that felt almost alive, as though Charles himself lingered here. Elliot made a beeline for the desk, his sharp eyes scanning its surface, while I moved toward the bookshelves that loomed like sentinels over the room. The journal we had found earlier sat waiting on the desk, its leather cover worn from years of use. Elliot flipped it open, skimming through its pages with careful intent. The entries described more than just Charles's fears. They painted a portrait of a man trapped between loyalty to his family and the growing realization that his legacy was built on sand. "He claims he only wants what he is owed," Elliot read aloud, his voice barely more than a murmur. "But how can one justify a claim built on generations of pain? If I refuse, I risk everything. If I concede—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Risk everything," I finished, my voice quieter now. "He was talking about William Hawthorne, wasn't he?" "It seems likely," Elliot replied, closing the journal with a soft thud. "But likely isn't enough." My attention shifted to a painting on the wall, a portrait of an unnamed Blackwood ancestor. There was something unsettling about the way his eyes seemed to follow me, as if he were daring me to uncover what shouldn't be found. I reached out, my fingers brushing the gilded frame, and it shifted slightly. "What is it?" Elliot asked, catching the movement out of the corner of his eye. I pushed the painting to one side, revealing a small, concealed cabinet behind it. "Another Blackwood secret," I muttered, glancing back at him. Elliot stepped closer, his interest piqued. The cabinet was locked, but he produced his lock-picking tools without hesitation. "They've underestimated me, as always," he said with a faint smirk, the kind that only appeared when he was on the cusp of discovery. The lock surrendered within seconds, and the cabinet creaked open to reveal its contents. A stack of weathered envelopes bound together with twine, and a single, ornate key resting atop them. Elliot plucked the key from its perch, holding it up to the light. "This doesn't belong to any of the doors we've seen," he mused, "but I'd wager it's meant for something important." I carefully took the bundle of letters, untying the twine to inspect them. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and heavy, with flourishes that suggested a certain arrogance. The letters were addressed to Charles, and their content sent a shiver down my spine. "They're from William," I said, my throat tightening. He was threatening him, demanding land and money, or he'd expose the truth. The truth about what? Elliot's tone sharpened as he leaned over my shoulder to read. I don't know. There's no specifics here, just veiled threats and accusations. But it's clear he wasn't going to stop until Charles gave in. Elliot's expression darkened, and he moved to the window, staring out at the frost-covered grounds below. We need to find out what truth William thought he held over Charles, and we need to figure out where this key belongs. The sound of footsteps outside the study drew our attention. The door creaked open, and Miss Turner appeared, her usual composure tinged with hesitation. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her eyes flickering between the two of us and the open cabinet. "Not at all," Elliot replied smoothly, slipping the key into his coat pocket. "We were just trying to piece together the events leading up to Charles's death." Miss Turner's gaze lingered on the stack of letters in my hand, but she said nothing about them. Instead, she straightened her posture and folded her hands in front of her. "If you're looking for answers, there's something you should see." She led us down a narrow staircase that spiraled into the depths of the manor, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their patterns too worn to decipher, and the flickering light of her lantern cast dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. "This wing has been sealed off for years," Miss Turner explained, her voice hushed. "Charles always said there was nothing worth salvaging here, but I think he was trying to protect something or someone." The corridor ended at a heavy iron door, its surface rusted and its edges marked with deep scratches. Miss Turner handed the lantern to Elliot, then withdrew a smaller, older key from her pocket. "This is as far as I go," she said, her tone firm. "Whatever's behind that door is your burden now." Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable, and he stepped forward to unlock the door. It swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a room that was more tomb than chamber. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp stone, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere unseen. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, and upon it lay a small, intricately carved chest. The patterns on its surface matched the key Elliot had found, and without a word, he moved to unlock it. The chest creaked open, revealing its contents. A single, yellow document sealed with wax, and a photograph tucked beneath it. Elliot lifted the photograph first, his brow furrowing as he studied it. "It's William," he said, holding it out for me to see. The man's face was gaunt and sharp, his eyes filled with something between anger and desperation. I reached for the document, breaking the seal carefully to avoid damaging the fragile paper. The words written within were a will, or at least part of one. "It's a revision to the Blackwood will," I said, my voice thick with unease. "It names someone else as the rightful heir to the estate, not Charles." Elliot's jaw tightened as he read over my shoulder. "This changes everything," he murmured. "If William knew about this, it would explain his claims. But it also raises another question. Who suppressed this document, and why?" As we stood there in the dim light of the chamber, the weight of the discovery settled over us like a shroud. The secrets of Blackwood Manor were deeper and darker than we had imagined, and the path to uncovering them had only just begun. For now, the answers remained elusive, hidden within the shadows that surrounded us. But one thing was certain: we would not rest until the truth was brought to light. The morning began with the manor shrouded in mist, its silhouette barely visible against the ashen sky. The damp chill crept into my bones as I followed Elliot down the grand staircase, the wood beneath our feet creaking as if the house itself were reluctant to wake. Something about the stillness felt heavier than usual, as though the walls were holding their breath. Elliot, ever composed, carried a leather notebook in one hand and his cane in the other. He glanced back at me briefly. "Let's get to it, Miguel," he said, his tone brisk. "The pieces are falling into place." The previous day's discovery, the letters from Charles to Victor and the torn fabric from the crypt, sat heavily on my mind. There was a thread connecting these findings, but it was still tangled and elusive. Elliot, however, was already unraveling it with that sharp mind of his. Miss Turner intercepted us near the base of the staircase, her hands clasped in front of her. "I noticed you spent much of yesterday in the crypt," she said, her voice even but her eyes searching. "Did you find anything of significance?" "That depends on what you consider significant," Elliot replied, offering her a small, enigmatic smile. "Rest assured we're making progress." Miss Turner's gaze lingered on him, her stern demeanor softening for just a moment. Then, with a curt nod, she turned and strode toward the dining room. "Are we still keeping her in the dark?" I whispered once she was out of earshot. "Only until we know what role she plays in all this," Elliot murmured, slipping the notebook into his coat pocket. "If we can't trust her, she'll lead us to answers another way." We didn't join her for breakfast. Instead, Elliot led me toward the eastern wing of the manor, an area we hadn't yet explored thoroughly. The air grew colder as we moved through the corridor, the sconces casting dim light on the peeling wallpaper. A peculiar smell lingered, faint and sharp, like charred wood and damp earth. "I'm not liking this already," I muttered, eyeing a particularly faded section of the wall. "It feels like a bad memory waiting to happen." "Or a buried truth," Elliot countered. He stopped abruptly in front of a door at the end of the hall, his gaze locking on the ornate brass handle. "This is it." "What makes you so sure?" "Call it intuition," he said, though I knew better than to believe it was just that. The door creaked open to reveal what must have once been a parlor. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light filtering through the half-drawn curtains. A faded rug stretched across the floor, and the remnants of a fireplace, blackened and crumbling, sat against the far wall. But what caught my attention was the large, cracked mirror above the mantel. It seemed out of place, its fractured surface reflecting the room's decay in distorted fragments. Elliot moved swiftly, his eyes scanning every detail. He knelt by the fireplace, brushing away soot and debris with his gloved hand. "Miguel, take a look at this." I crouched beside him, my brow furrowing as I noticed faint carvings etched into the stone. They were symbols, interlocking patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "An old practice," Elliot said thoughtfully. "These symbols were meant to ward off spirits or bind them to a specific place. It suggests someone here believed in or feared the supernatural." "Eleanor," I ventured, though I wasn't convinced. The ghost of Eleanor Blackwood seemed less malevolent and more misunderstood. "Perhaps," Elliot replied, his tone non-committal. He rose to his feet and turned toward the cracked mirror. "But I suspect there's more to this room than meets the eye." He tapped the mirror lightly with his cane, and the sound that echoed back wasn't quite right. It was hollow, muted. "There's something behind it," Elliot said, more to himself than to me. I stepped closer, brushing away the cobwebs that clung to the frame. Together, we managed to lift the heavy mirror off the wall, revealing a narrow passageway concealed behind it. The entrance was lined with bricks, some of them crumbling, and the darkness beyond was absolute. "After you," Elliot said with a faint smirk. holding up the lantern he'd retrieved from his coat. "You're joking," I replied, but he simply raised an eyebrow. With a sigh, I ducked into the passageway, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The tunnel was just wide enough for us to walk single file, and the walls seemed to close in with each step. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, mingling with something metallic, rust or blood. I couldn't tell which. Elliot's lantern cast flickering shadows that danced like specters on the walls. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small chamber. The air here was colder still, and my breath fogged in front of me. At the center of the room stood a simple wooden table, and atop it lay an open book, its pages yellowed and curling with age. Surrounding the table were more of those symbols, carved into the floor and walls. Elliot approached the book cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he read the text. "A diary," he said after a moment, "but not Eleanor's. This belonged to Victor Blackwood." I moved closer, peering over his shoulder. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though written in haste. The entries spoke of guilt, of debts owed and secrets kept. But one passage in particular caught my attention. "The curse cannot be undone. It binds us to our sins, each generation paying the price of the last." Charles thought he could escape it, but he was wrong. The manor will never let us go. A shiver ran down my spine. Do you think he believed this? "I think he knew more than he let on," Elliot said grimly. "And whatever he knew might have gotten him killed." As he turned another page, a loose sheet slipped free and fluttered to the ground. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly as I read the words scrawled across it. "In the end, it wasn't Eleanor who sealed our fate. It was me." The silence in the chamber was deafening. Elliot's jaw tightened as he read the note, his mind no doubt racing with possibilities. But before either of us could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the passageway behind us. I tensed, gripping the edge of the table. "Did you hear that?" Elliot extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and unhurried. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the gloom. A faint light appeared at the entrance to the chamber, illuminating the figure of a man. His face obscured, but his posture unmistakably menacing. "What are you doing down here?" the man demanded, his voice low and gravelly. His gaze flicked between us, narrowing as it landed on the diary in Elliot's hands. "We're investigating Charles's death," Elliot said evenly, his tone calm but firm. "And you are." The man hesitated before stepping fully into the light. His face was weathered, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. "Henry," he said, "I work for the estate." I recognized the name. Miss Turner had mentioned him briefly, describing him as reclusive and prone to outbursts. But something about his demeanor set me on edge. "This is no place for you," Henry continued, his voice rising slightly. "You're meddling in things you don't understand." "Enlighten us, then," Elliot said, taking a measured step forward. "What don't we understand?" Henry's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might strike Elliot. But then he shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "The past is best left buried," he said finally, before turning and disappearing into the passageway. Elliot waited until the sound of his footsteps faded completely before speaking. "He knows more than he's letting on. You think he's involved?" I asked, my voice still unsteady. "I think he's afraid," Elliot replied, his gaze drifting back to the diary. And fear can be just as telling as guilt. As we made our way back through the passage, my mind raced with questions. Who was Henry protecting? What was the curse Victor had written about? And how much danger were we in, uncovering secrets that so many seemed desperate to keep hidden? The answers, I knew, were waiting somewhere in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. The morning broke in muted grays, the sun's weak light barely penetrating the shroud of mist lingering over Blackwood Manor. The damp air clung to the estate like a secret it couldn't let go. From my window, I watched the branches of the gnarled oaks sway gently in the breeze, their skeletal forms scratching against the sky like ink on old parchment. Somewhere below, the soft crunch of boots on gravel signaled movement. Elliot was already stirring. It was time to begin. I met him near the study, where the day's plans took shape over the crackling fire that did little to warm the room. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at Charles Blackwood's journal lying open on the desk. The pages seemed almost alive in the flickering firelight, revealing a man consumed by fear in his final weeks. "We're closing in on something, Miguel," Elliot said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was as steady as ever, though I noted a slight edge to it. The ledger, the letters, the journal. Everything points to a meeting that sealed Charles's fate. But there's one player in this game we haven't accounted for. "Who's that?" I asked, though I had an idea where his thoughts were leading. "Agnes Turner," he said, his gaze piercing as it met mine. "The housekeeper. She's been here for decades, Miguel, spanning 2 generations of Blackwoods. If there's anyone who knows the truth, it's her." I couldn't argue with the logic. Agnes had always been near when questions of the Blackwoods' history arose. Her answers pointed yet careful. She had told us much, but how much more had she chosen to keep locked away? We found her in the East Wing, dusting a collection of ancestral portraits whose painted eyes followed us as we approached. Her movements were brisk yet precise, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Miss Turner," Elliot said, stepping into her line of sight. "Might we have a word?" Her hand paused mid-sweep, the feather duster trembling just slightly before she set it down. "Of course," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. "What is it you wish to discuss?" Elliot gestured toward the nearest armchair, and she hesitated before taking a seat. I remained standing, unsure if my presence would make her feel cornered, but her sharp gaze flicked to me as if sensing my unease. "It's about Charles's final weeks," Elliot began, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "We've uncovered letters, records, indications that he was being threatened. Someone wanted something from him, and they weren't afraid to use force to get it. I believe you know more about this than you've let on." Agnes's expression didn't falter, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. "Mr. Blackwood confided in me, yes," she admitted after a long pause, "but only in pieces. He was a proud man, Mr. Brooks, reluctant to admit he couldn't handle the situation on his own." "What did he tell you?" Elliot pressed, his tone gentle yet unyielding. She exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the armrests as though steadying herself. "He mentioned a man, William Hawthorne. He said Hawthorne believed the Blackwoods had taken something from him, something he was determined to get back." "The land dispute," I murmured, recalling Samuel's earlier confession. Agnes nodded. "Yes, but there was more to it. William wasn't just after the land. He wanted to expose the family's secrets. He threatened to release documents that would ruin the Blackwood name." "What sort of documents?" Elliot asked, leaning forward slightly. I don't know, she admitted, her voice faltering. Charles never showed them to me, but he was desperate to keep them hidden. He said they held truths that could never see the light of day. The room seemed to grow colder as her words hung in the air. I exchanged a glance with Elliot, whose expression had darkened. If such documents existed, they could unravel everything, both the Blackwoods' legacy and the motive behind Charles's murder. Did Charles ever mention where he kept these documents? Elliot asked. Agnes hesitated, then shook her head. No, but he was often in the north wing late at night, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. If he hid them anywhere, I suspect it was there. Elliot rose to his feet, his movements sharp with purpose. Thank you, Miss Turner. You've been most helpful. She didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the floor as we left the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, though whether out of loyalty or fear, I couldn't say. The north wing was colder than the rest of the manor, its windows allowing drafts to seep through gaps in the aged frames. Dust coated the surfaces of furniture covered in white sheets, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. This part of the house had been abandoned for years, its silence broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath our steps. We searched for hours, moving from room to room in search of anything that might point us toward the elusive documents. It was in what appeared to be an old storage room that Elliot's intuition paid off. He stopped suddenly, his gaze locking on a wooden chest half hidden beneath a pile of faded drapery. This, he said, dropping to one knee as he pulled the chest into the light. The lock was rusted but intact, its edges bearing faint scratches as though someone had tried, and failed, to open it before. I handed him the tools from his coat pocket, and within moments, the lock gave way with a satisfying click. The lid creaked open, revealing stacks of papers neatly tied together with twine. Elliot carefully lifted the top bundle, his eyes scanning the first page. These are financial records, he said, his voice tight. Transactions between the Blackwoods and Hawthorne. He flipped through the pages rapidly, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. It wasn't just land. The Blackwoods were paying the Hawthorns off for something they didn't want publicized. My stomach knotted as I leaned over his shoulder, reading the damning details. The payments were large, irregular, and spanned decades. It was a paper trail of guilt, though for what crime we still didn't know. Look at this, Elliot said, pulling out another set of papers. These were older, the ink faded but legible. A written agreement. Victor Blackwood and Samuel Hawthorne, detailing the terms of some kind of deal. What kind of deal? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elliot's jaw tightened as he read aloud. In exchange for the sum of $20,000, the family of Samuel Hawthorne agrees to relinquish all claims to the property known as Blackwood Manor and its surrounding lands. Furthermore, both parties agree to remain silent regarding the incident of October 1910. My blood ran cold. October 1910. That's the date from Eleanor's photograph. The date of the scandal. Elliot nodded grimly. It wasn't just a scandal, Miguel. It was a cover-up. The Blackwoods paid the Hawthorns to keep quiet about whatever happened that night, and William was trying to leverage that secret against Charles. The pieces were falling into place, but there was one glaring question. What had happened in October 1910 that was worth decades of silence and blood money? The answer, I feared, would be found in the very documents we held. But before we could delve deeper, a sound shattered the stillness. A faint creak of floorboards, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. Elliot's eyes met mine, his hand tightening around the cane he always kept within reach. We weren't alone. "Put everything back," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Quickly, I obeyed without question, my heart pounding as I stuffed the documents back into the chest and replaced the lock. The footsteps grew louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was approaching had been watching us all along. Elliot extinguished the lantern just as the door creaked open. In the dim light, I could make out a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, a figure whose silhouette I recognized immediately. It was Henry. "What are you doing here?" Elliot demanded, his voice sharp as he stepped between me and the intruder. Henry didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the chest behind us, and I saw his hands ball into fists at his sides. The air between us crackled with tension, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you've gotten yourselves into." The damp, earthy smell of the forest still clung to my senses as Elliot and I made our way back to Blackwood Manor after confronting Henry and uncovering the hideout location of William Hawthorne. The tension from our encounter refused to dissipate, lingering in the air between us like a shadow neither of us could shake. The house loomed ahead, its darkened spires cutting against the low-hanging gray clouds, an ever-present reminder of the truths still buried within its walls. Elliot walked with purpose, his cane tapping softly against the cobblestones, his sharp mind clearly piecing together the tangled web of motives and lies we had uncovered. I followed close behind, clutching the scrap of torn fabric we had retrieved earlier, feeling the weight of its implications heavy in my pocket. What had begun as an investigation into one man's death had spiraled into something far more insidious, an unraveling of generations of deceit and betrayal. Once inside the manor, the warmth of the fire in the drawing room did little to stave off the chill that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Miss Turner was waiting for us, her expression taut and her hands wringing together with a rare display of unease. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice low and careful. "We found Henry," Elliot replied, removing his coat and hat as he settled into an armchair near the fire. "And we know about his involvement with Charles the night he was killed." Miss Turner's lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to brace herself against whatever storm Elliot was about to unleash. "But Henry wasn't working alone," Elliot continued, leaning forward, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "He was part of something much larger, something that began long before Charles's death." I watched Miss Turner carefully. Her stern exterior had begun to crack, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or fear. "The truth always finds a way to surface," Elliot said softly, his tone no less cutting for its quietness. "Now would be a good time to tell us what you know, Miss Turner." For a long moment, she said nothing, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then, with a deep, shuddering sigh, she began to speak. "Charles was a good man," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But he was caught in a war he couldn't win. The Blackwood family, they've always been their own worst enemy. Greed, ambition, resentment. It's poisoned every generation, and Charles was no exception." Her words hung heavy in the room, but Elliot remained silent, giving her the space to continue. "William Hawthorne believed the Blackwoods owed his family restitution," she said, "and perhaps he wasn't wrong. Victor Blackwood, Charles's grandfather, was a ruthless man. He took what he wanted regardless of the consequences, and the Hawthornes paid the price. But when William approached Charles for justice, Charles refused to admit the sins of the past. He thought it would tarnish the family name. Instead, it cost him his life, Elliot murmured, his expression unreadable. Miss Turner nodded. William became more desperate, more aggressive. He wanted land, money, anything to make up for what was stolen from his family. I didn't know the extent of his threats until it was too late. Did Charles confide in you? I asked, leaning forward. Only bits and pieces, she admitted. He didn't want to burden me with the details, but I could see the strain it was putting on him. And then, the night he died, her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to hold back tears. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. It was clear that whatever secrets she had kept, she had done so out of loyalty to the man she had served for so long. Go on, Elliot urged gently. That night, he told me he was going to meet William, she said. He believed he could reason with him, that he could put an end to the threats once and for all. But when he didn't return, she closed her eyes tightly, her voice breaking. I should have stopped him. I should have done something. Elliot sat back in his chair, his expression contemplative. What about Henry? How does he fit into all of this? Miss Turner hesitated. Henry. He's always been loyal to the Blackwoods, but he's also always looked out for himself. I suspect William coerced him into helping with his schemes, whether through threats or promises, I don't know. But I don't believe Henry intended for Charles to die. He's a coward, not a murderer. And yet, his involvement makes him complicit, Elliot said, his voice hardening. Whether or not he struck the fatal blow, he played a role in the events that led to Charles's death. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I glanced at Elliot, waiting for his next move. His mind was a fortress, impenetrable and always several steps ahead. We need to confront William, he said finally, rising to his feet. Now that we know the truth, it's time for him to face justice. The path to William Hawthorne's hideout was treacherous, the forest dense and the ground uneven. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. Elliot led the way, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows that danced like specters among the trees. When we reached the cabin, it looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The windows were shuttered, the door slightly ajar, and the roof sagged under the weight of age and neglect. But there was a faint light flickering inside, and the faint sound of movement told us we were not alone. Elliot motioned for me to stay back as he approached the door, his cane held firmly in one hand. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting a yellow glow over the cluttered interior. William sat at a battered table, his head in his hands. He looked up as we entered, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. You've already taken everything from me, he said, his voice hoarse. What more do you want? The truth, Elliot replied coldly. Charles Blackwood is dead because of you, and it's time you took responsibility for what you've done. The heavy door of Blackwood Manor slammed shut behind us, echoing through the cavernous halls. I followed closely behind Elliot, my heart still pounding from the confrontation with William Hawthorne. The truth of his actions weighed heavily on me, yet a sense of unease still lingered. Something about William's confession didn't sit right with me, or perhaps it was the suffocating air of the manor itself, thick with the ghosts of its sordid past. Elliot came to a halt in the grand foyer, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of portraits that loomed over us. The ancestors of the Blackwood family seemed to watch us in silent judgment, their painted faces etched with disapproval. William claimed it was an accident, Elliot said, breaking the silence, his voice measured and calm. And I believe he may be telling the truth, at least partially. I frowned, adjusting my scarf as I turned to him. Partially? You don't think he's the sole culprit? Elliot didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, as though listening to the house itself. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the silver head of his cane. There are inconsistencies, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Something about this entire affair. It's too convenient, too perfectly wrapped in guilt. The truth, Miguel, rarely presents itself so neatly. I let out a slow exhale, the chill of the foyer creeping into my skin despite the roaring fire burning in the hearth. What do you suggest we do next? We need to speak to Ms. Turner again, he said, his gaze snapping back to mine, sharp and unwavering. She knows more than she's let on. And with the ledger, William's confession, and Samuel's involvement, I suspect she can fill in the gaps. As if summoned by our conversation, Miss Turner appeared at the top of the staircase, her posture stiff and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The way she descended the stairs reminded me of a soldier marching to battle, resolute but weary. Miss Turner, Elliot called, his voice ringing through the space. Might we have a word? She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Of course, Mr. Brooks. Shall we speak in the drawing room? Elliot inclined his head, and we followed her into the room where so many of our conversations had taken place. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their volumes a silent chorus of history and despair. A flickering chandelier cast a dim glow over the space, illuminating the dark wood paneling and the heavy velvet curtains. Miss Turner stood by the unlit fireplace, her hands folded neatly in front of her. What is it you wish to discuss? Elliot didn't waste time with pleasantries. You've been a steadfast guardian of this house and its secrets, Miss Turner, but I believe it's time for complete honesty. You know more about Charles's death and the Hawthorns' involvement than you've let on. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then, she let out a weary sigh, her shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken truths. Very well, she said quietly, her voice laced with resignation. What is it you wish to know? Start with the night Charles died, Elliot said, his tone firm but not unkind. Where were you? What did you see? Miss Turner's gaze drifted to the unlit fireplace, as though the answer were hidden somewhere in the ashes. I was in my quarters, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I heard raised voices, Charles and someone else. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was heated. Did you recognize the other voice? Elliot pressed. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the floor. It was William, she admitted finally. I'm certain of it. He and Charles had been arguing for weeks. And yet, Elliot said, his expression thoughtful, you didn't intervene. Why? Miss Turner's eyes hardened. Because it wasn't my place? She snapped, though her voice was tinged with guilt. Charles made it clear that his affairs were his own. He didn't want my interference. And afterward? I asked, stepping forward. What happened when the argument ended? Miss Turner's breath hitched, and she shook her head. I went to the foyer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I found Charles lying at the base of the stairs. First, I thought he'd fallen, but there was blood, too much blood. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and I could see the anguish in her eyes. This was a woman who had carried the burden of that night with her ever since. "Did you see anyone else?" Elliot asked softly. "Anyone who might have been there after the argument?" Miss Turner hesitated, and a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossed her face. "There was a shadow," she said finally. "A figure moving through the corridor. I didn't see who it was, but it wasn't William. He'd already fled." Elliot's eyes narrowed. "A third party," he murmured, more to himself. "Someone else was there that night." The room fell silent, the weight of Miss Turner's confession hanging heavy in the air. My mind raced with possibilities. If William wasn't the only one present during Charles's final moments, then who else could have been involved? And what was their motive? "We need to examine the ledger again," Elliot said suddenly, his sharp gaze snapping to mine. "If there's a third party, their name might appear in the records." I nodded, and we left Miss Turner to her thoughts as we made our way back to the study. The ledger was still where we had left it, its worn leather cover a testament to its age. Elliot flipped through the pages with practiced precision, his brow furrowing in concentration. "There," he said, pointing to a name scrawled in the margins of one of the entries. "Alastair Hawthorne." "Another Hawthorne?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder to read the name. "I thought Samuel and William were the only living members of the family." "Apparently not," Elliot replied, his tone grim. "It seems Alastair was written out of the family history, his name deliberately omitted from the records." "Why would they erase him?" I asked. "Because he was the black sheep," Elliot said, his fingers tracing the name on the page. "A man with a reputation for violence and greed. If he's still alive, he may have had a motive to conspire with William, or even act on his own." The revelation sent a chill down my spine. A third Hawthorne, hidden from history with the means and motive to commit murder. It was a possibility we could not ignore. "We need to find him," Elliot said, closing the ledger with a decisive snap, "before he disappears into the shadows once again." The search for Alastair Hawthorne led us to the outskirts of the estate, to a dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. The air was thick with tension as we approached, the weight of our discovery pressing heavily upon us. Elliot knocked on the door, his movements deliberate and precise. There was no answer, but the faint sound of movement inside told us we were not alone. "Alastair Hawthorne," Elliot called, his voice steady and commanding. "We know you're in there. We need to speak with you." The door creaked open slowly, revealing a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and piercing blue eyes. He regarded us with suspicion, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "We're here about Charles Blackwood," Elliot said, his gaze unwavering, "and the events that led to his death." Alastair's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. Elliot took a step forward, his expression hardening. "Lying won't help you, Mr. Hawthorne. We know you were at the manor the night Charles died. Miss Turner saw your shadow." Alastair's grip on the doorframe tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might slam the door in our faces. But then, he stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Come in," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The inside of the cabin was sparse and dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. Alastair sank into a rickety chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I swear, I didn't kill him." "Then tell us what happened," Elliot said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Why were you there that night?" Alistair let out a shuddering breath, his hands trembling as he spoke. "William asked me to come," he admitted. "He said he needed my help to confront Charles. But when I got there, it was already done. Charles was dead, and William was gone." "And you didn't report it?" I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. Alistair shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. The storm had been brewing all evening, thunder rumbling low over Blackwood Manor like an ominous warning. By the time we returned to the study with Alistair Hawthorne's confession fresh in our minds, heavy raindrops were pounding against the windows in a relentless rhythm. The flickering light from the fireplace cast shifting shadows across the room, and the weight of the revelations we had uncovered hung heavy in the air between Elliot and me. Elliot stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the gray-blue backdrop of the storm outside. He tapped a single finger against the edge of his cane, lost in thought. "We're close, Miguel," he murmured, his tone low but edged with purpose. "Too close to stop now." I sat in the armchair nearest the fire, the warmth doing little to shake the chill that had settled in my bones. "Alistair's confession fills some of the gaps," I said, running a hand over my face. "But there's more to this, isn't there? Something we haven't seen yet." Elliot turned from the window, his steel blue eyes locking onto mine. "There's always more," he said simply. "The truth isn't just a single thread, Miguel. It's a tapestry, and every thread we pull leads us to another. It's time we examine the connections in full." Before I could respond, the door creaked open, and Emily Blackwood stepped into the room. Her presence was a stark contrast to the storm raging outside, calm and composed, though her tightly clasped hands betrayed her nerves. "Mr. Brooks, Mr. Vasquez," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "I just spoke with Ms. Turner. She mentioned you found Alistair and that he confirmed certain suspicions." "Yes," Elliot said, his expression softening slightly. "Alistair's involvement paints a clearer picture of the events leading to your uncle's death. But his confession raises another question. Who orchestrated it all? Who truly had the most to gain?" Emily's brow furrowed, her hands tightening. "I don't understand. Alistair, he admitted to being there. Isn't that enough?" "Not quite," Elliot said. "Alistair was a pawn. The question remains, who was moving the pieces?" Emily exhaled shakily, lowering herself onto the sofa opposite me. "Then what do we do next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We go to the heart of the matter," Elliot said, his tone decisive. "And for that, we need access to every corner of this manor, including those that have been locked away." Emily's gaze darted toward the study's locked cabinets, then back to Elliot. "You mean the East Wing," she said, realization dawning in her eyes. "That part of the house has been sealed for years. Even I've never been inside." "Sealed doors only mean one thing," Elliot replied, already moving toward the door. "Secrets waiting to be uncovered." The storm outside only seemed to grow stronger as we made our way to the East Wing. The long corridor leading to the sealed doors was lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, their oil-painted eyes following our every move. The thunder above growled like a restless beast, and the dim light from the sconces flickered with each gust of wind rattling the manor's windows. Elliot came to a halt in front of the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. They were bound with rusted iron bands, a thick chain securing them shut, and a tarnished padlock dangling in the center. "Emily," he said, turning to her, "do you know if there's a key?" She shook her head. "Not that I'm aware of. Miss Turner might know, but—" "No need," Elliot interrupted, pulling a slim set of lock-picking tools from his coat pocket. He worked silently, the soft clicks of the tumblers barely audible over the storm. Within moments, the chain fell away, and the padlock hit the floor with a dull thud. The doors groaned as they swung inward, revealing a space shrouded in darkness and dust. I covered my nose and mouth as we stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Emily followed hesitantly, her eyes wide as she took in the room's forgotten grandeur. The east wing had once been a lavish parlor, though time and neglect had reduced it to a shadow of its former self. Cobwebs draped the corners of the room, and sheets covered the furniture like ghosts standing vigil. A grand piano sat against one wall, its surface warped and keys yellowed with age. Elliot raised his lantern, the warm glow revealing an ornate tapestry on the far wall. It depicted the Blackwood family crest, surrounded by intricate symbols and Latin inscriptions. He moved closer, studying the details with a keen eye. "What do you see?" I asked, stepping beside him. "Something deliberately hidden," he said, his fingers tracing the edges of the tapestry. "Look here. These symbols aren't just decorative. They're part of an old sealing ritual designed to protect something. Or someone." "Protect from what?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "From the truth," Elliot replied. With a sharp tug, he pulled the tapestry aside, revealing a concealed door set into the stone wall. The door was smaller than the others in the manor, its surface engraved with the same symbols as the tapestry. Unlike the oak doors outside, this one bore no lock, only a single circular indentation in the center. "It requires a key," Elliot murmured, his gaze shifting to Emily. "Do you recognize this symbol?" She studied the engraving closely, then shook her head. "No, but wait." Her brow furrowed, and she reached into her coat pocket, retrieving a small, ornate locket. "This belonged to Eleanor," she said, holding it out to Elliot. "I found it in the attic years ago, but I never thought it might mean anything." Elliot took the locket, his expression unreadable. He pressed it into the indentation, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. The room beyond was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was small and circular, the walls lined with shelves filled with crumbling books and yellowed scrolls. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a single leather-bound book. Elliot approached the pedestal cautiously, his hand hovering over the book. The leather was cracked and worn, the cover embossed with the Blackwood family crest. "This is it," he said softly, lifting the book with reverence. "The Blackwood Codex." Emily and I exchanged a glance as Elliot opened the book, his eyes scanning the faded pages. The codex was filled with dense script and illustrations, rituals, contracts, and genealogical records dating back centuries. It was a chronicle of the family's dark history, a web of secrets that had ensnared generations. Elliot stopped abruptly, his brow furrowing as he read a specific passage. "Here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It mentions a binding pact between Victor Blackwood and an unnamed associate, a pact sealed with blood." "What kind of pact?" I asked, leaning closer. "A deal," Elliot replied, his tone grim. "Victor traded something of immense value to secure the family's fortune. But the pact came with a curse, a curse that would pass down through the generations until the debt was repaid. Emily's face paled. And Charles? Was the latest to pay the price, Elliot finished. This curse, it's the shadow that has haunted your family for generations. And now we have the means to break it. Before we could fully process the implications, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A loud crash from somewhere outside the room. Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he said, closing the codex and tucking it under his arm. "Emily, stay close." We stepped out into the east wing, the lantern's light casting long, flickering shadows down the corridor. The storm outside howled louder than ever, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the direction of the main hall. Elliot moved quickly but cautiously, his cane tapping against the stone floor in a deliberate rhythm. My pulse quickened as we turned the corner, the faint outline of a figure disappearing into the darkness ahead. "Stop!" Elliot called, his voice sharp. The figure hesitated, then bolted toward the stairwell. Without hesitation, Elliot gave chase, his stride purposeful and unyielding. I followed close behind, the sound of my own breathing drowned out by the thunder overhead. We reached the grand staircase just in time to see the figure, a man cloaked and hooded, vanish into the west wing. Elliot slowed, his expression unreadable as he turned to me. "They're trying to stop us," he said simply, "but they won't succeed." I nodded, my resolve hardening. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, but neither did we. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach, and we would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The storm outside reached a fever pitch as we pursued the figure into the west wing, its thunderous roar mirrored by the chaos brewing within the halls of Blackwood Manor. The flickering lamplight revealed no sign of the cloaked man who had vanished into the shadows, leaving only echoes of hurried footsteps behind. Elliot, lantern in hand, paused at the arched doorway leading to a long, unlit corridor. His breath was steady despite the tension that gripped the air. "He's leading us somewhere," Elliot murmured, his voice calm yet sharp. "We need to see this through." I swallowed hard, clutching the edge of my coat against the damp chill that seemed to cling to this part of the manor. "Through to what?" I asked, though I knew better than to expect an answer. Wherever this path led, I doubted it would offer anything comforting. Elliot motioned forward, his cane striking the ground in a deliberate rhythm as we moved deeper into the west wing. The passage smelled faintly of mildew and decay, as if it had long been forgotten even by the restless ghosts that haunted this place. At last, we reached a door unlike the others we had encountered in the manor. It was smaller, almost inconspicuous, with deep grooves carved into its oak surface. Strange symbols were etched along its edges, the faded script forming shapes that sent shivers down my spine. Elliot raised the lantern, his eyes narrowing as he studied the markings. "A binding ritual," he said quietly, his finger tracing one of the symbols, "meant to seal something or someone inside." Before I could respond, the sound of a lock turning reverberated through the corridor. The door creaked open slowly, as if beckoning us inward. Without hesitation, Elliot stepped inside, and I followed close behind. The room beyond was a circular chamber, lit only by the faint glow of an oil lamp flickering on a central pedestal. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with books, scrolls, and jars filled with substances I dared not identify. At the far end of the room, the cloaked figure stood with his back to us, hunched over a large, weathered book spread open on an ancient wooden table. "You've gone to great lengths to keep this hidden," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. The figure froze, then turned slowly to face us. His hood slipped back, revealing a gaunt, pale face etched with years of anger and despair. It was Alistair Hawthorne, the hidden third member of the Hawthorne family, and the man whose presence had eluded us until now. "You don't understand," Alistair said, his voice hoarse but defiant. "The curse, it binds us all, the Blackwoods and the Hawthorns. Everything Victor did, everything he stole, it's all led to this." Elliot's expression remained impassive, though I could see the flicker of curiosity in his sharp gaze. "Then explain it to us," he said. "What exactly did Victor Blackwood do that has trapped both your family and his in this endless cycle of vengeance?" Alistair gestured to the book in front of him, his movements frantic. "He made a pact," he said, "not just to secure his fortune, but to destroy my family in the process. He stole everything from us: land, wealth, dignity, and then he cursed us to bear the consequences of his ambition." I stepped closer, my gaze shifting to the open book on the table. Its pages were filled with dense script and grotesque illustrations depicting rituals and symbols similar to those we'd seen throughout the manor. "And this curse," I said, "it's why William and Samuel fought so hard to reclaim what they believed was theirs?" Alistair's eyes blazed with fury. "They didn't just believe it, they knew it. The curse has bound us to this place, to this feud, for generations. William thought he could end it by taking back what was stolen, but he was a fool. The only way to break the curse is through blood." Elliot stepped forward, his cane tapping against the stone floor. "And that's what you've been preparing for, isn't it? A ritual to end the curse, to sever the bond between your family and theirs once and for all." Alistair nodded, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of the book. "I've spent years piecing it together, searching for the answers hidden in this wretched place. But I need the final piece, the ring, the one used to seal the pact. Without it, the curse will endure." Elliot exchanged a glance with me, his expression unreadable. I reached into my coat pocket and withdrew the ring we had found in the crypt, its symbols glowing faintly in the lamplight. Alistair's eyes widened as he saw it, his hands reaching out instinctively. "This is what you need," Elliot said, holding the ring just out of reach. "But I need to know one thing first. Why did you murder Charles?" Alistair froze, his face contorting with anguish. "I didn't want to," he said, his voice breaking, "but he wouldn't listen. I begged him to help me find the ring, to end this madness, but he refused. He cared more about the Blackwood name than about breaking the cycle of pain his family caused. It was an accident. I swear it." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession pressing down on all of us. For a moment, I thought Elliot might refuse to hand over the ring. But then, with a resigned sigh, he extended his hand and placed it in Alistair's trembling palm. "End it," Elliot said, "once and for all." The ritual began almost immediately. Alistair lit the candles arranged in a precise circle around the room, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. He placed the ring at the center of the pedestal, surrounding it with symbols drawn in chalk and blood. Elliot and I stood at the edge of the circle, watching as Alistair chanted in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick with energy, the atmosphere vibrating with an almost tangible intensity. My pulse quickened as the symbols on the ring began to glow brighter, their light pulsating in rhythm with the storm outside. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the room, and the flames of the candles flared wildly. The light from the ring erupted in a blinding burst, and I shielded my eyes as the air was filled with a piercing, otherworldly wail. When the light faded, the room was deathly silent. The candles had burned out, and the ring lay shattered on the pedestal, its curse broken at last. Alistair collapsed to his knees, his face wet with tears. "It's over," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The curse is gone." Elliot placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. "You've done what needed to be done. Now it's time to face the consequences." Alistair nodded, his body trembling as he rose to his feet. Together, we left the chamber, the echoes of the past finally silenced. As the storm subsided and dawn broke over Blackwood Manor, the house seemed to exhale for the first time in centuries. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The curse that had bound the Blackwoods and the Hawthorns for generations was no more. Elliot and I stood by Eleanor's grave once more, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the grounds. Emily joined us, her expression a mixture of sorrow and hope. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked softly. "It's over," Elliot confirmed. "The truth has been revealed, and the curse is broken. Blackwood Manor is free." As we left the graveyard, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of closure. The shadows of the past had been banished, and the restless spirits of Blackwood Manor could finally find peace. But as we walked back toward the manor, Elliot's expression grew thoughtful, and I knew that his restless mind was already turning toward the next mystery waiting to be unraveled. And so our work continued,